Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Veterans Breakfast Club Masters of the Air, our special program. Tonight is Thursday, February 8th. It's great to see you all. My name is Sean Hall. I'm the Director of Programming with the Veterans Breakfast Club. We're a nonprofit here in Western PA, and our mission is to create communities of listening around veterans and their stories to connect, educate, heal, and inspire. We've been doing this for 16 years now, mostly in-person breakfasts, but at the turn of the pandemic, we pivoted and became an online platform as well. We kind of hybrid now. We do in-person breakfasts, we do events, we do our Monday night Zoom program, which is a happy hour. And we also are now hosting, because it's winter here in Pittsburgh, and we don't like to leave the house during that time, so might as well do 2 episodes per week. We are doing a Masters of the Air special, which has been going very well, I must say so. I'm very excited by the series. But also, I've been enjoying the actual series. Glenn, you're our host for Masters of the Air. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great, doing great. And by the way, for those of you not in Pittsburgh, it was 58, 59 degrees and sunny today in mid
I did leave the house.
February. I went out for a walk in shorts. So, pretty nice day in Pittsburgh.
Was it better than when you were in Florida?
No, actually not. No.
Not quite.
That's for the sun that shows up every day. This sun always shows up once a week here in Pittsburgh.
That's true. So, Glenn, we're going to jump right into it. I know tonight I do have a poll. Do you want to do that now, or do you want to wait a little bit?
Well, why don't you inform the people about the poll, bring it up,
Sure.
Show them how to fill it in. Then let's ask them to fill it in during the first 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll come back to the results.
Sure thing. Okay, so last week we started a poll. It's a really quick 3-question thing. This isn't a review of our episode like we normally ask you to do about our survey. This is a poll about Masters of the Air. It's going to ask if you watched episode 3 of it, and no worries if not. It's going to ask you if you liked it or not, and it's going to ask you just like what you liked or didn't like. And that's a little short answer. You can give us 2 words, 10 words. It's limited in the poll, but I'll pop that up now, and feel free to fill it out if you see it on here. Should pop up on your screen. Let me know if you do or do not see it. And what you can do is you can also drag that poll by clicking on the top where it says polls/questions. You can drag that usually off to the side if need be. We realized last week, I think a lot of people really liked sort of answering the poll. It was good to get an idea of our audience of who's seen the episode and what general thoughts were personally. And this isn't to sway anybody's decision. I really loved it. It was probably my favorite episode thus far of the series. I've really been enjoying it overall.
Yeah. Okay, let's get started with our featured guest tonight, and that is Lieutenant Colonel retired Rob Ehlers. Rob, say hello, please.
How's everybody doing?
All the way from Westerville, Ohio. Welcome, Rob. It's a great honor to have you here. Rob, rather than me going into an extensive background, you're also an Air Force veteran, I want to say. Why don't you give us a little bit about your background? How long did you serve? What branch did you serve in? And how did you become Dr. Robert Ehlers?
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for the kind introduction, Glenn. I am an Ohio boy, directly west of Glenn. I live just north of Columbus. Grew up in a suburb of Columbus. Joined the Air Force in 1986, served about 23 years, was an intelligence officer, did a good bit of what I call air intelligence in the book that I'll be referring to on and off tonight. Good bit of mission planning, targeteering, weaponeering, tactics, electronic warfare countermeasures, that kind of stuff with B-52 crews and others later in my time in the Air Force. The doctor came about because the Air Force wanted me to teach at a school called the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies down at Maxwell Air Force Base, formerly Maxwell Field, the home of all of Air University. And so they sent me back here to the pretentiously renamed The Ohio State University to get another degree here. So I've bachelor's from Ohio State, master's from the University of Florida, doctorate from Ohio State in military history.
Wow, quite an impressive background, Rob. That's and it certainly put you on the path to write this excellent book, which I just finished reading last week. And if we could just ask you to hold off for about 15 or 20 minutes, we'll get into the book and the discussion about targeting Germany, air intelligence. Okay, fast. I have to tell you, I've read a lot of books on the 8th Air Force. Never anything this in-depth about air intelligence. I have to say, I really didn't even know what it was until I read this book. So we're going to get into that in about 15 or 20. Okay. So last week, we found that about 60% of our audience have been watching on Apple TV the episodes of Masters of the Air. About 40% were not. And I'm guessing that's about the same breakout this week. We'll find out when we see the survey. But there's certainly a large percentage of you that have chosen not to watch it yet or don't have access to Apple or whatever. So what we want to do is give you a little bit of background on this third episode on Apple TV called the Regensburg Raid. And it is about the raid that took place on August the 17th, 1943. And I have just 5 or 6 slides that I would like to show you. So first, let me get through this whole thing about sharing. I'm getting better at, slowly but surely, with the tutelage of, the kind tutelage, I should say, of Sean. There we go. Everybody seeing that okay? Sean, we okay with that? Yeah.
Yes, we can see it.
So to my compatriots here who we were talking to earlier, I did find a better map very quickly, just before we came on air, right? So you recall last week that we talked about how 1942, all the raids by the 8th Air Force, all the missions were none of them were to Germany, is the best way to put it. France, Norway, places like that. Okay. In January of 1943, the 8th Air Force begins its missions into Germany. Even then, though, the missions were not deep into Germany. Okay. So this mission, which takes place on August the 17th, which is exactly 1 year after the very first mission flown by then Captain Paul Tibbets, takes place on the 17th. And it is, as you can see on this map, a deep penetration, the deepest penetration up until that time into Germany, to Schweinfurt and Regensburg. Regensburg was the site of a fighter assembly plant. Schweinfurt was the famous ball bearing plants that get featured many times on different missions. This was the first mission. It's a rather complex raid. I think they make it a little too complex in the Apple TV series. It was a little hard to follow if you don't know anything about it to begin with. Okay, so they put together a plan where the 2 bomber wings that they have, which is LeMay's bomber wing of 146 planes and Williams bomber wing of 230 planes. The 2 wings are supposed to go up at the same time, rendezvous over the channel, and fly into deep Germany. But then, as you can see, split right in here, okay, over Belgium, and in an attempt to try to fool the German Luftwaffe as to where they were going. LeMay's wing, which includes the 100th Bomber Group, was supposed to, let me get rid of this survey here, was supposed to, or it did fly to Regensburg, right? And then you see, and it's so graphically shown in the Apple TV series, it turns, and instead of going to England, it turns and goes south to Africa and flies all the way to North Africa to land in an effort to start shuttle missions, okay? So the problem is that the weather, which we talked about last week as well. The weather in England is just terrible that morning, and they sit on the runway for 2-3 hours waiting to decide if they're going to go. Finally, they're released. They're given permission to go, but only LeMay's bomber group is given permission to go. And that's about, I think, 7:30 in the morning. Williams' bomber wing, I should say, is held back and doesn't leave for another 3+ hours, I believe it is. By the time the Williams bomber wing leaves England, LeMay's group is well into Belgium, Luxembourg, approaching Germany, and they're getting, as the episode showed so graphically, they're getting shot to pieces because all the German fighter planes are attacking them. And they started attacking them near Brussels because the P-47s turned back, right? Because they didn't have the range, as we've talked about before. The idea then was for the other bomber wing to fly to Schweinfurt, turn around and go back to England, which they in fact do. But the timing is so thrown off by the bad weather that the Luftwaffe forces are able to bring all their planes to bear. And at this point, they're up to 500-600 fighter planes, right? Bring all those planes to bear on each bomber group one at a time. And they're slaughtered. They're just slaughtered, right? Of the 376 planes, 60 are destroyed in the air. That doesn't include the planes that are damaged, the injuries, the wounds that occur on the planes, but the plane gets back to England or makes it to North Africa. So it was a disaster of a mission, except for a couple of things, which I'll illustrate to you in just a minute. Okay. And it was a mission, by the way, and Don Miller covers it in his book, that General Ehlers disagreed with, strongly disagreed with, did not want to carry out this mission, but was forced to by the higher-ups, i.e. Hap Arnold, in Washington, D.C. Okay, let me see if I can advance this here. This is the man who was in charge now of the bomber command of the 8th Air Force. So originally it was Ehlers in charge of bomber command. He's moved up to be in charge of the overall 8th Air Force. General Frederick Anderson, West Point grad of 28, had been a bomber wing commander in 42, highly intelligent man, very, very good leader, et cetera, et cetera. He's the man that makes the decision. And he decides to release LeMay's group first and hold back Williams' group. Didn't have to. He could have aborted the whole thing, or he could have sent both groups at the same time through the bad weather. Now, the concern they had about letting both groups go up in the bad weather was the risk of accidents in the formation of these two, which were then very large bomber wings, the largest they had put up in the air until that time. Because you go up through those clouds in the bad weather, there were many, many accidents of planes running into each other as they were trying to form up. So he's the one that made the decision, and he had to live with the results. These are just some of the other commanders of the 8th Air Force. I just wanted to make it clear. I mean, these were highly intelligent, very accomplished men. The names are probably not too familiar to you. On the far left is Frank Armstrong, who is famous only because he's the character under that Bernie Lay then writes 12 O'Clock High, and instead of calling him Armstrong, calls him Savage instead. That's on the far left. Next is General Newton Longfellow, and then the fellow in the middle is someone we talked about last week, Brigadier General Hayward Hansell, who goes on to become a wing commander and play a great role out in the Pacific. General James Hodges, and then the well-known Brigadier General Fred Anderson on the right. These are the command guys. You could just imagine these guys sitting around that morning of August 17th at 4 and 5 o'clock in the morning, trying to give their best counsel to Frederick Anderson as to what to do and how difficult it must have been for these men. The mission is actually carried out very well, and it shows it very well in the miniseries. This is the actual bombing of the Regensburg fighter plant, and it was considered highly destructive. It was well done, and it probably took out this fighter plant for 30 days. After the war, Speer, that's Albert Speer, the minister of, what was he?
Armaments.
Armaments, yeah. Said, boy, we were really scared after this raid because we thought if you guys, the 8th Air Force continued doing this, day after day, week after week, that these plants would go down for a long time. Unfortunately, we couldn't do it day after day. We go back several times more, but before we go back, the plants are to some degree or another up and running. And that's what Rob is going to be talking about later. The 8th Air Force, the 100th Bomb Group, and LeMay's entire bomber wing then turn south, as I showed you on that map, and they head over the Alps to Africa. And in fact, they're given extra fuel in what was called a Tokyo tank, which Rob, I never heard of a Tokyo tank before, but it's in this article by Bernie Lay I'm going to bring up in a second.
Mhm.
And it gives them 1,000 miles of extra range, right? And they make it all the way to North Africa, land there. I think the statistic for at least 100th Bomb Group, 21 planes went up and 11 planes made it to North Africa. So the balance were destroyed at some point along the way. This is Bernie Lay. Despite that spelling, it is Bernie. Okay. And Bernie Lay is a fascinating character. He's one of the 7 founders of the 8th Air Force with Acre. Okay. So he's a senior command officer. He's a staff officer for all of 42. He's dying to get a bomber command. Acre finally promises him a bomber command in 43. In fact, a week or two after this, he's due to become a bomber group commander. Bernie Lay becomes an observer on this mission. And as the assignments were made that morning of the mission, as they're about to take off, Bernie Lay's position was changed from one bomber to another. And the understanding, but I don't know that I have the proof for it, it's in Don's book, is that it was Clevin who made that decision to move him. And he moved him to more of an inside position so that he wasn't in as much danger. And the key to this is just fascinating to me. Bernie Lay's on this mission. He's a co-pilot. He observes all this chaos. He observes all these B-17s being shot down, this incredible force of German fighters coming at them hour after hour after hour before they even make it to the target. He looks over his left shoulder and he sees the plane that he was supposed to be in blown to smithereens, completely blown up, no shoots. So that decision saved his life. And then the next part of this is also fascinating, at least to me. Bernie Lay is now in a position where he's watching Clevin's plane. And as you saw in the episode, if you did watch it, Clevin's plane had been damaged rather badly and was slowing up, and it wasn't very clear that he was going to be able to make it. And Bernie Lay was able to hear all of the radio chat going on in that plane, right? And as they illustrated very graphically in the movie, there's a point where the co-pilot says, "Oh, we've had enough. This plane is going down." And he actually rings the bailout bell. They don't show that exactly in the movie, but he actually did ring the bailout bell. Clevin turns on him and in rather graphic language, which I won't repeat here, says, "No way, we're not bailing out. We're going to sit here or we're going to take it. We're going to make it to the bomb site. We're going to drop our bombs, and then whatever happens, happens." Bernie Lay hears all this, right? So the Clevin's plane stays with the formation. They make it to the bomb site. They bomb Regensburg, and then they're able to make it all the way from Regensburg to North Africa, all on the skill of Clevin's flying capabilities. So what's interesting is Bernie Lay then goes back, and Bernie Lay had a journalist background, I believe, Rob, as I recall.
Yes.
He goes back after the mission and he writes it all up for the Saturday Evening Post. And it's published in the Saturday Evening Post in November of 43. And it's called, I have a copy here, and we're going to put a link to the article in the chat room. "I Saw Regensburg Destroyed" by Bernie Lay Jr. And you can tell he's a writer. I just read this earlier today. Rob helped find this. Todd DiPastino helped find this. It wasn't easy to find. And it reads like a novel. It reads like a novel. And there's 2 things about it, then I'm done. One, he features, well, towards the end of it, he talks about this major. He doesn't actually name him in this article and what he did. And he thought that major should have earned the Medal of Honor, or at least some high-level medal. And the major he's talking about is Clevin. It subsequently comes out that it is Clevin, and Clevin becomes a war hero due to this article in the Saturday Evening Post. And then you realize how well this is written, because if that name Bernie Lay is familiar to some of you, it's because he is the author of a novel that comes out right after the war called 12 O'Clock High. One of the best war novels ever written at any war, but certainly one of the best war novels of World War II. Then he's the scriptwriter on the movie itself. So obviously he was there. He saw all these men, how they suffered, the courage they had. And I still believe it's the best movie ever made on World War II, certainly on the 8th Air Force in World War II. So it's, I think, an interesting story. I don't know, Rob, any thoughts on this? You want to tell me how interesting I made this, or does anybody really care too much about it?
No, it's good stuff. And obviously the raid in episode 3, the first major raid into Germany, made with F model B-17s, made without fighter cover. Timing was all messed up. The deception plan failed. So, Glenn covered all of that pretty nicely. The bombing was quite accurate, more accurate than it generally was, even in later missions as the crews got more experienced, because the weather was generally pretty bad in Europe. But as far as Bernie Lay and 12 O'Clock High, that was a leadership case study in the Air Force. We studied it at Squadron Officer School. We studied it at Air Command and Staff College. We studied it after I was a colonel at Air War College. It was just, it was not to be missed, so to speak.
And I was telling Rob, I know corporate leadership consultants who have used it as an example of leadership, relative to corporations. So the other thing I about that movie, and I heard some chatter about it on podcasts, is you go watch the movie, and there's virtually no combat scenes in it, virtually none. There's some stock footage from the 8th Air Force records in it. It's almost all, the old style movie of talking faces back and forth, but, fascinating movie. So let's move on to the episode that hopefully a lot of you watched. Can we see the survey, Todd? What sort of came out of the survey?
Sean, yes.
Oh, Sean, I'm sorry.
That's all right. I take it as a compliment.
You're so much better looking than Todd. Todd really had that fake mustache last week, which wasn't all that good.
I don't have as good of a coif, though. He's got such a nice coif. We had 53 answer in the room, and 52% had watched it. 48% said no. Of that, see here, of the 52 that watched it, 52%, or the 27 that answered, 22 of them liked it. 6 of them were somewhere in the middle. So no thumbs downs. Let's see here. As for the surveys, the writing out, let's see, it makes you feel like you are right in the aircraft. Harrowing. It was okay. Not certain I will watch more episodes. A lot of action. Lots of personal experiences. Amazing air battle scenes. Very emotional for me to see what our brave aviators had to endure for our freedom. Someone said they liked the AI action. It was brutal. Someone said it's improving, but still falls short of my admittedly high expectations. Its dialogue is stilted and the scenes are too short. Seems like an adult version of Sesame Street versus Mr. Rogers. Great scope of war hazards and human responses. Someone says it's supposed to improve by episode 5 and on, so looking forward. Depicts the chaos of the air war in a way I can experience and understand on a new level. Let's see here. And special effects, the story or accuracy that they liked about it. And then given the particular mission and lengthy flight time, I was surprised how short the episode was. Another one, put you in the driver's seat, have to admit they were heroes. Yeah. Some highlights from the survey. Thank you, everyone, for filling it out. Yeah.
And if anybody would like to speak up, in person here on the Zoomcast, please just raise your hand and tell us what you thought of it. Let me ask a few of our experts that are on right now, and I'll start with Rob. I know you saw it, Rob. What were your reactions to that third episode?
I enjoyed it. I actually did a mega watch this morning and took in all 3. There's a lot to fit in a book that runs to over 500 pages. And to turn that into a human interest, you know, a television series that has deep human interest is challenging. I think as far as they were able, the producers and directors of the show did well with that. I thought they did quite well with the combat scenes. Not that I was there, obviously, neither born nor in that particular Air Force specialty code. But from everything that you read, written by the veterans who flew the mission, written by official historians who collected the records, seemed realistic. And when you see it with that kind of computer-generated, computer graphics, enhancement, and so on, fairly shocking, frankly.
Yeah. Difficult to watch some of those scenes. Let me ask if I could ask Colin Heaton, if we could unmute Colin, Sean.
He is unmuted.
Colin, most of you he's been very faithful, been on every one of these Thursday nights now. Colin is a technical expert, consultant to the Master of the Air movie, and incredibly knowledgeable. Colin, your thoughts on that episode?
I thought it was quite good. I thought they kind of short-shifted the 100th Bomb Group on the battle scene because it was a lot worse in reality than was depicted on the screen.
Wow.
But I wish that they had also shown the German side of it, because during that first wave of fighter attacks, Josef Priller led his Geschwader into combat, and after the first pass on the bombers, he said, "To hell with this! We're going to go around again and get the other groups in the air." He was coordinating the aircraft from JG 2 and 26 with Egan Meyer and the others, and then Gallon was on the radio with Kamhuber saying, "How many do you have on radar?" And Kamhuber said, "The radar is down."
Ah.
Yeah. And so Gallon's like, "Okay, get everybody in the air." So they went and got the students from the fighter pilot school who were not even fully fledged pilots yet. They got the night fighters out of bed who had just flown the night before to get into their aircraft. It was crazy. I mean, it was a free for all, and every single German fighter pilot who had an aircraft was in the air at some point in time that day over Schweinfurt-Regensburg, and the ones in France and Belgium flew towards those targets to land, refuel, and get up in the air to try to catch the aircraft on the way back.
Yeah. And is there a number? How many sorties were flown that day by the German fighter groups?
If I remember, I believe there were 1,450 plus sorties flown that day.
Wow. So some of those planes were landing, refueling, rearming 3-4 times.
That's correct. Yeah. In fact, Priller flew 4 missions that day. Georg Peter Ader flew 3, but on his third one, he was shot down for the 12th time, in the war. And then I believe Heinz Gnocke was shot up on his second flight. But almost every pilot flew 2 sorties if they had an aircraft airworthy when they got back to refuel and rearm. There was no respite for the Germans either, and the results we know.
Yeah.
I have a quick question on that. Is if you flew 4 sorties that day, and the Americans weren't circling, they were, aimed at a destination. So flying, how often? I mean, they'd have to go back, land, and then catch up to them again.
That's correct. Or fly to an airfield further along the estimated route of departure from the target area. Let's say, they flew in through Belgium, they hit, and they're going to naturally anticipate they're going to fly out over the North Sea because that's the shortest route to escape German fighters. So most of the guys started landing in Denmark, Holland, and places like that, and to refuel. And a lot of the guys went back up in the air. Now, a full 1/2 the pilots who went up in the air never encountered a bomber because the bombers were not where they thought they would be.
Yeah, the other element of this is that because of the mistiming of what they wanted to do, there was LeMay's group in the air for 4 hours to get to the target, and then goes south. And about that time, Williams' bomber wing is coming in. So the Germans had, there were bombers in the air for 7-8 hours over Europe. So they had more than enough time to fly all these sorties.
Yeah, they did.
Steve Snyder, I think I know you were going to be on. I don't see you. Could you wave your hand, and there he is. Hi, Steve. Could we unmute Steve?
Yes.
Hi there.
Hi, Steve. Thank you for coming on tonight.
My pleasure. Sorry, I missed last week.
Yeah, oh, not a problem. Not everybody can make every Thursday. We understand that. Steve's one of our, what I've come to now call our contributing panel of experts. Steve's the author of a book called Shot Down, which is the story of his father's experience as a B-17 pilot. And Steve, today is a very special day. What is this day?
Yeah, it's the 80th anniversary of my dad's plane being shot down on February 8th of 1944.
Right. That must sort of
by Hans Berger and Siegfried Merrick. Both those planes were shot down as well. Siegfried Merrick, he crashed and he was killed, but the gunners on my dad's plane shot Hans down, but he was able to bail out and he made it through the war.
And I saw your email earlier today. Hans just passed away recently.
Yes, unfortunately, I found out on January 20th. Yeah, he died. He did hit 100 years old though. So he last October 9th he turned 100. I'm going to Belgium in late August, early September to attend the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Belgium, and I was hoping that Hans would be well enough for me to go to Munich and maybe visit him one more last time, but that's not going to be.
Remind me, Steve, your father's B-17 experience was with what bomb group and during what time frame?
The 306 bomb group based at Third Reich in the first Air Division, and he was shut down my dad arrived right after Second Schweinfurt on October 21st, 43. And then he was shot down on February 8th of 44. It was his 8th mission. It was to Frankfurt.
And Steve is, deeply knowledgeable about the 8th Air Force and the bomber group. What are your impressions of Masters of the Air so far? Are they meeting your expectations? What do you think?
Yes and no. That it's kind of a complicated question. I think this third episode was the best one that they made. A couple just general observations. Because I've talked to some of my buddies that are really into the 8th Air Force and the bomb groups, and I think you have a different perspective if you really know a lot about the subject. Because it's easy to kind of pick and find faults, and you're looking for more technical things that the average viewer would never notice or never look for. And so that I think in a way it taints it a little bit. But I'm enjoying it, that's for sure. It's much different than the Band of Brothers in the Pacific. I think it's watching in those, because you had guys fighting the enemy face to face, whereas at Masters of the Air, the Air War over Europe, those guys are at 25,000 feet and it's more impersonal, so it doesn't have quite the impact that the other two previous series did. But that third episode was very intense, without a doubt. I think they're doing a great job of showing the audience of what it was like to be a combat airman in the 8th Air Force. I think they're doing a good job, from the briefings all the way through, taxiing and takeoff and forming up and all the, conditions that they had to face. And then once they got over occupied Europe, the flak they had to endure and the enemy fighters. And the scenes inside the plane, I think, were really dramatic. They did a great job there of kind of showing you what the terror and horror was like.
Yeah. Some of it very difficult to watch. That one piece of the ball turret gunner being stuck in the ball turret as a plane goes down, and the one other, I don't know what, if he was a gunner or an officer, but making a decision to leave him in that ball turret because he couldn't save him. That's gut-wrenching.
Without a doubt. And and to be in those bombers and seeing the the B-17s just going down all around you. Some planes, you have some parachutes, were seen, and others, all 10 crewmen were lost. And so, yeah, the horror of that. But, that's what those guys did. They had a job to do, and they did it. That, is the thing you just have to admire and be amazed about is what those guys did under those circumstances. Like they said, no, we're going to go ahead and we're going to bomb that target. That's our job, and we're going to do it.
Yeah. And that scene where Clevin, basically tells the co-pilot, we're not bailing out. We're taking it. We're going all the way in. I think that might have been that actor. I think, what's his name? Austin Butler. That might have been his finest moment. He seemed more real and more mature to me than he has in the first couple of episodes.
Well, you mentioned Austin Butler. I don't know how many people have seen the movie Elvis that he starred in, but that's another thing that's kind of throws me off a little bit, because in Masters of the Air, he sounds just like he did in Elvis, like, thank you very much. He has that cadence. And so when I'm watching him, that just kind of throws me off that he's, in the 8th Air Force, in this.
I think he's a fine actor and all that, but I think it's a casting mistake, in Band of Brothers and the Pacific, really were not well-known actors. And I know for me, the first episode, as soon as I saw Austin Butler on screen, all I could think of was Elvis.
Yeah.
I'm like, I didn't know Elvis was a B-17 pilot. I mean,
yeah, exactly. I feel the same way,
Yeah. Okay.
Joe McCarthy had his hand up.
Yeah, Joe, how are you? Nice to see you.
Great. Great talking to you, Glenn and Sean. Thanks for the opportunity. I guess my favorite scene from episode 3 was the scene where Buck Clevins takes his mortally wounded B-17 to Africa, and it's all shot to pieces. You see pieces of the plane flying off, by the way, when he's asking I think it was the top turret gunner, how's it look back there? Well, a piece flies off as he's talking. But he's coming back for final approach with no engines. All his engines had gone out, and he's now a glider. And he's flying. And can you imagine that, that close and losing all your engines, and your control surfaces aren't even working. You don't even know if you're going to be able to land. And then he finally lands. And when he hits the runway, you see that scene where he just puts his head back, and it's just that rush of relief. It reminds me, I knew a good friend, his name was Don Mitz. He was a captain, a B-24 Liberator pilot. He told me this story where he flew 8 hours on a mission. This was to Palesti, the oil refinery. Comes back, and he's all shot to pieces. He's gliding in the same way Buck Clevins did. He actually had one engine he was coming in on, and he lands, and that engine quits right on the run, runs out of gas right on the runway. I'll never forget it. He tells me the story. He had his helmet on, and he took his helmet off, and all his hair came off into the helmet.
Oh, jeez.
And because of the stress he was under. And it kind of that moment that my friend Don told me about. Don won 2 distinguished flying crosses, by the way. He was so famous, was that Axis Sally would actually taunt him over the air and say, we know where your squadron is, and we're going to blow you out of the sky the next time you come over. And that moment he told me about the relief where he took off his helmet and his hair came out, just kind of rang true I'm sure that was the moment that Buck Clevins had when he finally landed his plane, saved his crew. That was a real telling story for me.
Yeah. And again, difficult to watch the part where they pull the dead member of his crew off.
Yes.
And that's in Don's book. That man lost both his legs at ease. And was
this series has really rekindled my interest in my dad's story. My dad's passed 30 years now. He was a top turret flight engineer, top turret gunner, and just been reading more, trying to get more information about him from the archives, but I've gotten a lot of information. It's an oral history from my dad, but I've been able to find things that he told me about into more detail. So I was thankful that I was one of these young kids pestering my dad about, his stories to maybe open up a little, because most veterans don't talk about this kind of horror. But, fortunately for me, he was able to share some things with me.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Joe.
Sure. Thank
Is
you.
there anyone else in the audience who would like to voice a thought or two about the episode? Just raise your hand electronically or physically, and we'll try to catch it. Let me
Take a
ask.
look through.
I see we have Ed Cottrell with us tonight. Wasn't sure I saw Joe Peterburs. Is he with us? Yeah, I see Joe. I see you right now, Joe. Would either one of you like to volunteer a thought on this episode, if in fact you've been watching it?
I'll just kick in with a couple words. I thoroughly enjoyed last week because being in the air and going through a few things, not to the extent that these fellows went through, I thought the personal experiences were great. And if you really are interested in finding out what it's like to fly a bomber, you learned a lot last week, believe me. And all I can say is I'm thankful I flew the P-47 Thunderbolt, because I guarantee I don't think I would be here today if I were in a B-17.
I don't know. That your adventures look just as dangerous to me. One man at a time instead of 10 at a time. Joe, any thoughts on the episode?
Well, yeah, it reaffirmed my initial impressions when I was over there, flying escort, that these guys, the crews, were the bravest of the brave. And, for a fighter pilot, just to see how they just went on to the target and just kept pressing on and everything. I mean, it depicted but I always, what I've written down is that, slack that you could walk on, and fighters with no mercy, and bombers blowing up, and then even the debris in the air was dangerous for them. And for them to be able to continue on onto the mission, onto the target, that is bravery that it's I think never matched that I have observed. One thing that I did I would have liked to have seen was more of a intertwining of what the higher echelons of the Luftwaffe and the 8th Air Force were doing. They mentioned about those Spats doing this, or but I'd like to have some kind of a scene where you have them sitting around arguing about these things and how they came to a final decision on them. And particularly, I would have liked to have seen what the Luftwaffe was doing about this at the time.
Yeah. Well, that was Colin Heaton's comment about the Luftwaffe. We're not seeing that other side, which would be just as fascinating.
Yes.
The part about the senior command, I agree 100% with. That's why I try to put some of these things in context and showed you who Frederick Anderson was and these other senior commanders who behind the scenes were the ones making the decisions that led to the young men having to do what they did. I suppose if they put everything in this miniseries that all of us would like to see, it would last 2 years. It'd last as long as the war did.
Yeah.
So that's the hard part, right? Okay. Well, Ed and Joe, again, it's always an honor to have you on the show, and thank you for contributing. And by the way, I'll be in touch with you very soon. We're going to dedicate one of our episodes here on one of the Thursday nights to the two of you and the 9th Air Force and the roles both of you played in the war. I'm kind of waiting for the chronology of this to play out a little bit. So I'll be in touch about a date in the next 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah, it'd be nice to wait until to get the fighters over there to do some effective escort for.
Well, I'm really going to be interested to see if they show, what they have to say about the P-51 arriving on the scene and the difference that it made, and Doolittle and so forth.
Right.
I don't believe they're going to make a major point about that, but
but it's worth mentioning.
Oh yeah, I mean Okay, Sean, unless there's anyone else that would like to volunteer a comment, I'd like to move on to Rob's part in the program here. Are we ready to move on there? Is that okay?
Yep. Looks good.
Okay. Rob, the book. I have a pretty library kind of copy of it. Targeting the Third Reich, Air Intelligence and the Allied Bombing Campaigns. What motivated you to write this book? Why did you want to do this?
So professional and personal reasons. Professionally, as an air intelligence officer, it was our job to understand what our air assets should be targeting in any kind of a joint, and by joint, in World War II parlance, I mean ground, air, sea, a large-scale campaign, all the way down to a smaller scale, single service air effort. What is it that we should be targeting? How would we know that we were producing effects using the weapons that we chose? And how did we know that those effects were translating into some sort of effectiveness in terms of helping senior commanders and policymakers achieve objectives and whatever end state they were trying to achieve, which in this case was the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers, and specifically Nazi Germany in this context. So, I read book after book after book about air warfare, many of the books gripping, and Miller's book is a case in point. But as an air intel type, and when I say intel, it's just a contraction of intelligence. It's not a computer chip flying through the air. That's a different thing. But as an air intel guy, something I never saw discussed was how the air intelligence process developed, how it informed what the bombers went after and the bomber crews went after, and how they determined whether those strikes individually and collectively were doing the kinds of things to German transportation capacity, their ability to maneuver across and within theaters, their ability to produce and distribute enough oil, petroleum oil, lubricant products, ammunition, demotorize the German army and the Air Force, frankly, run it out of fuel, whether they were doing those things effectively, whether they could tell whether or not they were doing those things effectively. So as a military historian, which is the more personal side of it, I just said, this is not going to be exciting stuff, and it's not going to keep people up at the edge of their seats when they read whatever book I produce. But it's important for people who follow the air war and the sacrifices of the heavy bomber and the medium bomber and the fighter bomber crews, all of who played a critical role in different ways in these major campaigns against transportation, oil, the Luftwaffe, etc. But I wanted people to have a book that they could turn to so that they could understand what the real underpinnings were of that sort of intellectual infrastructure that steered the bombers to the right targets by and large.
So, and Rob, you did a great job of it. It is deeply, very deep book, very interesting, full of statistics, full of evidence, full of proof. It's not the mystery novel page turner that some people might prefer, but for those of us who are fascinated by it all, it was very well done, and I appreciate the work. So let me ask you a few basic questions and see where we go and see where the audience would like to go with this. So first, explain the development of air intelligence by the Brits versus the US. The Brits, as I understand, were way ahead of us. Of course, they were in earlier in the war. How did that unfold?
Yeah, they were way ahead, both by design and by necessity. So both the British and the Americans had developed what I would call an embryonic set of air intelligence capabilities, basic photo reconnaissance, basic annotation of potential targets, basic, for instance, in the First World War, the Brits and the Americans planned to knock out all of the nitrogen fixation plants along the Ruhr, which were, the way the Germans made nitrogen and other chemicals artificially for the manufacture of ammunition. And obviously, in the First World War, artillery was the king of the battlefield. And so they had plans as early as the First World War to do things of that nature. They never got there. And then in the interwar period, both services shrank, their air intelligence capacity shrank from embryonic to virtually nothing. Although the Brits obviously began, as the Germans began to rearm, began to think pretty seriously about what would happen if there was another war. And eventually they developed what they called the Western Air or Whiskey Alpha plans that were designed to strike the Ruhr heavily early in the war using daylight bombing techniques. So by 1939, the first photo reconnaissance version of a Spitfire had flown its maiden voyages, its maiden sorties. In 1940, they had captured the entire Ruhr on film and were building target folders specifically to launch daylight raids. Unfortunately for the Brits, who had not enough fighters and short-range fighters, and mostly medium bombers at that point in the war that were not well armed, the first several times they tried to bomb German targets, they were massacred, between 60 and 80% loss rates on a given raid. But they had built this outstanding air intelligence capability at a place called RAF Medmenham, also known as Danesfield House, northwest of London along the Thames River. And all of their photo reconnaissance units at Mount Farm, Hendon, and several other places, sprang up around there so they could be in communication quickly. The Americans, almost unaccountably, the bomber barons who developed this very detailed high-altitude precision daylight bombardment doctrine, completely missed the air intelligence piece, and it was not entirely their fault. First, the Army Air Forces were still part of the Army, so to the extent that the G2, the Chief of Intelligence for the U.S. Army, was interested in anything, it was not targets for heavy bombers. He was more interested in the strength of a Panzer division or what a Japanese infantry regiment looked like, or how they could go after ground units more than air units. But the bomber barons kind of missed the boat as well. They had a very, very small air intelligence section, less than 20 people, as late as July of 1941, and they never entertained very seriously the construction, the design and production, and the operational employment of photo reconnaissance aircraft. So they went into the war without any, and they ended up using the P-38 and renaming it the F-5, F-4, and then later F-5, the more advanced version. The problem with the P-38 is that it didn't have the combat ceiling because of the way the engine was constructed. Didn't have the combat ceiling of either the Spit or the Mossy, the Mosquito, the two British primary photo reconnaissance aircraft. So they lost about 2.5 times as many aircraft and pilots. The Germans were able to get up generally high enough with specially, and Colin probably knows a great deal about this, with specially designed and stripped down 109s to get high enough to engage these F-5s in particular. They very rarely got up high enough to get the Brits. So two very different approaches to air intelligence. One, the Brits, paradoxically, developing a very good capability for what they thought would be their daytime precision bombing campaigns, which turned into night area bombing campaigns, although very damaging to the German war effort. And then the Americans, who rolled in simply unprepared to, from an intelligence perspective, to understand anything about the effects or to gather enough intelligence about the effects they might produce and what kind of effectiveness that might mean in their larger campaign.
So paradoxically, just as this last bullet point says, the Americans Air Force ended up relying on the RAF air intelligence, at least initially, to help them with their targeting.
They did, and were heavily reliant on the RAF throughout the war, particularly on the photo reconnaissance and the what became known as the Allied Central Interpretation Unit at Medmenham as Americans started to join. By the end of the war, there were about 2,100 people at Medmenham. These are photo interpreters, photogrammetrists, people who would use precision to look very closely at bomb damage, with the damage that had been done, and then start to make what were called first phase assessments. But by the end of the war, slightly over half of the people at Medmenham were American. And so the Americans pretty quickly understood that they needed air intelligence capacity. And they ended up setting up an air intelligence school, first in Maryland, then it moved to outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and then eventually down to Florida for the last couple of years of the war. And the Americans ended up turning out more of the various kinds of air intelligence specialists that were necessary to target and then to assess damage and to assess effectiveness than the Brits did. But they didn't have as long to develop their expertise. And so the Brits always played a bit of a leading role in the process.
Let's move on to the next slide and a little bit different tack. So it's always been a little confusing, I think, to the general reader, all the various operations that the 8th Air Force stage or the Allied and the Bomber Command staged. Transportation plan, oil plan, Big Week, the Berlin Week, all these different things sort of, in most people's mind, run together. But arguably, Operation Argument was perhaps the most important plan that was put together. So could you speak to Operation Argument and the pictures and the bullet points you have up here?
Sure. So, obviously by late 1943, after first and second Schweinfurt, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, and then October, the return mission and equally severe losses, the Americans reached a pretty tough decision point. They knew that the airmen knew that they were not going to be able to carry out the high altitude precision daylight bombardment doctrine they had foreseen without fighter escorts. And interestingly enough, and it comes out less clearly, but it comes out without more attention to this question of intelligence and understanding what they needed to do to the German war effort, and in this case, the Luftwaffe, which they characterized as an intermediate objective of overriding importance. Those are the direct words. So in other words, the Luftwaffe in and of itself was not decisive or even the quasi-decisive thing that they were going after, but that campaign to defeat the Luftwaffe was decisive in the sense that it opened the skies of Europe. So when the Allies came back at it, when 8th Air Force and 15th Air Force, now both under what was called USAF or USTAFE, U.S. Strategic Air Forces Europe, under Karl Spaatz, came back at it, they had a new approach, and they had new aircraft. Obviously, they had drop tanks for these new aircraft called P-51s. Not that the P-47s and the P-38s weren't still in the fray, at least up until Normandy, when they started to peel off and go after German targets on the ground. And we can talk more about that later. But Hap Arnold, who's up in the upper left corner, said, I want you to go after the Luftwaffe wherever you find it, in the air, on the ground, and in the factories. And Jimmy Doolittle, who was a fairly revered figure most of the time by most of his airmen, chafed at the idea that the fighters would be held to close escort duty, the way they had been in late 43 when they had shorter range. And that their job was to bring the bombers back alive. And there's that famous discussion where he talks to the head fighter guy, and he says, "Is that really your job?" And he said, "I want you to unleash your fighters, go, because if we don't destroy the Luftwaffe everywhere, if we don't kill its pilots, once we gain air superiority, destroy its fuel sources, force its factories to disperse even faster than they already have been, so that we can mess with the numbers of aircraft produced, quality control, and the rest of it. Until we do that, we can't achieve the follow-on objectives that we have to speed Allied victory and to reduce casualties for the Allied forces." And at the end of the day, that's really what bombing did. It didn't win the war, but it helped in a big way by speeding victory and reducing casualties. So Operation Argument, specifically Big Week, Argument as a whole, which didn't gain decisively air superiority over the European continent, over the Reich, until well into March. Some people argue April, other people even argue the very end of April, early May, but started to see a pretty significant drop off in Luftwaffe responses, reactions by March, by early to mid March. But you can see just some photos here. So there's a German aircraft getting strafed on the ground. There's a pilot bailing out. Here's some Focke-Wulf pilots. Colin can tell you a lot more about which unit that was and maybe who some of the individuals were in the photo, actually, given his level of expertise. But they're waiting to go again, probably at a dispersal airfield. Colin mentioned earlier that the Germans had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dispersal airfields, and the way they would stay in the fight was to make their passes on the bombers. When they needed more fuel or more ammo or both, they would fly to if their radar apparatus, if the Comhuber line and everything else was working and their radio comms were good, they had a good sense of where the bomber stream was going. They'd put back down at a dispersal airfield, in the bomber's path, refuel, and get back up again. The problem, of course, is that when they came back to it, they had P-51s to deal with, and you saw those as well on the slide.
Yeah. Let's bring Colin in as you tried to there for a moment, Rob, because Colin has such deep knowledge about the German, about the Luftwaffe. So it's spring of 1944. Everything that Rob just talked about is beginning to happen. P-51s in the air versus the P-38s and so forth. What did it look like from the Luftwaffe side? What were they thinking? What were they doing?
Well, I could tell you what Hitler said in a meeting with 5 guys I interviewed who were in the room.
Okay.
As soon as by April of 44, there was a meeting with Hitler, Goering, Galland, Heinrich Himmler, Martin Bormann, let's see, and 2 or 3 others were there. And Johannes Steinhoff was in the meeting, and he had a good take on it. Hitler said, and I'm not going to use the language translated from German into this, but he said, well, if you can't stop these damned American fighters from flying over Berlin, I'm just going to kill the fighter program and make more flat guns. So that's what he said, Yeah.
But he didn't carry through that. He didn't, obviously.
No, actually, Gallen talked him out of it. And he said, well, give us some time. We've got some new, the 262 is being tested, and let's see what happens with that. And so Hitler was more focused upon losing his ass at the Battle of Kursk in July of 43. So he was kind of focused on the Eastern Front.
Yeah. When did it become obvious to the German tactical commanders, the guys on the ground commanding the Luftwaffe, that they were losing the air war?
Oh, after Doolittle unleashed the fighters, like Hubzimke's guys, by February of 44, there wasn't a senior German officer, a major ace, who thought they had a happy hillbilly chance in hell of winning that air war. I mean, I interviewed over 300 of them, and I'll tell you, they didn't think they were going to win the war. They thought they could fight long enough to sue for a separate peace.
Yeah.
That's what they thought.
Which was never in Hitler's mind. Never.
Hitler actually entertained the thought in a meeting that I interviewed with SS Lieutenant General Karl Wolff was in the meeting, and Hitler had said, "Do you think the Americans would actually agree to a negotiation or a truce?" And Karl Wolff said, "My Fuhrer, the British didn't agree to it. Why with the Americans?" So that's where that went.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, I have another question for Rob, but before I ask that question, let me invite the audience to ask Rob any questions, anything that's on their mind, anything that's in the chat room. Sean?
I know that Doug is at the is an 8th Air Force buff. I asked you to unmute Doug, but he might have stepped away because I see his video is off. Let's see if let's see here.
I'm here.
Anita?
I'm here.
Doug's here as well.
There's
Anita,
Doug.
I just asked you to unmute, so Doug, then Anita.
I was just going to say, from a personal point, I had tears the whole time I watched it. My dad was on that raid, and he was awarded the DFC for his missions during that raid.
Hi, Anita. I had the great opportunity to speak with Anita earlier this week. She is the president of the, is it 96 Bomb Group? 96 Bomb Group Association. And her father obviously was with the 96. She sent me a 8 or 9 page write-up that her father did. Her father was Danny M. Christ. Is that the way to pronounce it? Christ. Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Air Force, stayed in the Air Force afterwards. I haven't had the chance to read it yet, Anita, but I'm going to. Todd told me he read it and loved it. It was very well done. And at some point here in the next few weeks, we're going to ask you to speak to that.
I'd love to.
Yeah, if I may, for those of you who understand military symbology, that was a DFC with 3 bronze oak leaf clusters, if I was seeing it correctly, which means he won 4 distinguished flying crosses.
Wow. Wow. Fascinating. We're going to share all that story with you at some point here in the next couple of weeks.
Hey, Glenn.
And Doug.
Yes, Doug.
Yes, sir.
You had a question, Doug.
Oh, no, somebody mentioned that they had a question for me, I thought, and thought I had stepped away, but I'm here.
No, I thought you might want to comment on the subject matter tonight.
Well, I've been studying this since probably 1965 with the 12 o'clock high series. I think the Library of Congress would love to have my library of books that I have on the subject. So I've been very, very interested in the series, looking so forward to seeing it. And I just very impressed with what I'm seeing on the television. Like you said earlier, if we're going to go into all the details necessary, this thing would be years in the making and watching, and that's not going to happen. But I think it's the 100th Bomb Group is a microcosm of the overall story. I think that the producers of this have done an excellent job, and I look forward to seeing the rest of it.
Yeah, yeah. And Doug, you're a veteran. Do I recall that right? I think Brad Washbaugh was telling me about you, and I apologize. I've not had the time to contact you and talk to you, but Marine Corps veteran?
Yes, sir. I'm a Marine Corps CH-53D helicopter pilot.
Ah,
Hoorah!
So I didn't go into the Air Force because the Air Force wanted hard science degrees, and I wanted to study history. And the Marine Corps didn't care what you studied as long as I had a degree. They'd take you. So that's what happened there.
Well, look at their standards. They took Brad. You know.
Yeah, yeah.
Where's Brad? Is he on tonight? I saw him earlier.
Yeah, Brad's there.
He said, cut the mic.
Now they pulled me out of the Army to put me in the Corps.
Other question before I ask Rob another question myself. we're getting long in the tooth here, so we want to get as much in as we can.
Carol put in the chat, how were pilots and crews assigned to the various boxes A through D on a mission? Was it strategic or random, and did they take turns being in the more dangerous positions?
Good question, Carol.
Yeah,
Rob?
I think I will, clearly once the lead navigator concept went into play, that individual, well, had to be the lead navigator. There was a good bit of attention paid to experience and quality of air crew based on the position they were assigned. But beyond that, I would be unable to tell you exactly how that rolled. I suspect Steve might be able to. One or two of the other historians in the crowd might be able to get into details.
Colin, any ideas on that one, or Anita?
I do not know. My interviews with LeMay and Doolittle and those guys, they never mentioned that. I don't know.
I would venture, and this is it's always danger guessing, that the I'm gonna struggle with the name of the officer in each bomber group, but the chief air exec had control of that. He was sort of the assistant bomber group commander, and I would guess that he was the man that did it. Now, exactly how he chose which group was in which position, I don't know. That's a great question that I'm going to write down and do some research on and see if we can't come up. Someone's got a hand up. I think it's Steve.
Has.
Steve?
Steve. Have you unmute, Steve?
Yeah. Yeah, it's not that clear. I know that, take the, you have the air divisions, then within the air division, you have the combat wings. And there were 3 bomb groups in each combat wing. And they rotated which group led the wing. I'm not sure how they determined that, but they did rotate. Same thing with the bomb group. There were 4 bomb squadrons in a bomb group. And typically only 3 of the squadrons went up on a mission and 1 squadron did not, to give them a break. So, and also their position, in the group or in the wing or in the division varied, whether you were, the lead group, the high group, or the low group. And so I've never read anything that really specifically states how they determined that, but it rotated all the time as far as, where they were placed in the formation.
Rob, it sounds to me like a PhD thesis question for something
Ohio State. Probably beyond me at this point. The one constant, both for visual and radar bombing, as they got into that somewhat lamentable, difficult business later in the war, into the winter months in 44 and 45, is that the best navigators, lead navigators, whether they were bombing visually or whether they were using what the Americans called H2X, which is a very crude radar bombing capacity, were going to be in the lead. And once they dropped, and the flare popped out of the bottom of their bomber, the other bombers dropped on them. But I know there was a rotation, as Steve said, but beyond that, I don't know. Did people get, did they get a bonus if they did well in a mission and get a safer spot in the combat box? I have no idea. Yeah. I don't know.
We're going to dig into that. That could be a lucky Luckadoo question, which I'm sure he'd have a thought on. And we're fortunate enough to be able to contact him with these different kinds of questions. So
Doug mentioned in the chat that A Wing and a Prayer by Harry Crosby talks about this in detail.
Oh,
good.
Something else on Wing and a Prayer, because I was looking up Harry Crosby and doing some reading on him. There's a movie coming out called A Wing and a Prayer on Harry Crosby's book. And I think, who's the star? McQuaid, one of those. Yeah, it's
Randy Quaid, I think.
Quaid, yeah. Yeah, and it comes out soon, I think, in the next month or two. Does anybody know for sure? Yeah. Clearly a follow-on effort to the Masters of the Air.
I unmuted Brad. He had a question way back. So, Brad, I don't know if your question was answered over the course of the program. I don't know, Brad, if you... Sorry, I have to flip through. Brad, we might... Oh, there you are. Sorry, Brad, you muted again. Okay, never mind. You got answered. You're good. Okay, thank you.
So let me get to this question of Rob. And I'm not sure there's a specific slide in your program here, Rob. If there is, let me know which one it is and I'll put it up. But I was fascinated in the book. There's a couple of chapters, a lot of reading about Eisenhower's role in the strategic bombing campaign in the winter and spring of 44 as he becomes Supreme Allied Commander. And the famous scene that is played out in just about every movie you see on the subject, where he threatens to Churchill to leave that post if he doesn't get control of the strategic bombers. And
there is a slide in there where you'll see.
That's slide 9.
Yeah, I think that's right. You'll see pictures of all the senior air commanders, and then on the right you'll see a V1, a buzz bomb.
I'm going to get it up.
Okay, good. So, yeah. So once as the 8th and the 15th were battling it out for air supremacy over the Reich, and obviously more specifically and covertly for air supremacy in France and over the Normandy battle area, Eisenhower made it very clear to Roosevelt and Churchill directly that he expected to have full, what we call OPCON, or operational control, of all the heavy bombers, and in fact all of the aircraft in theater for concentration of effort to before, during, and after the landings in Normandy, anticipating that they needed to slow down German reinforcements immediately before and during, and that if they were successful in gaining a lodgment and then eventually breaking out, that air power, particularly tactical, what we would call tactical air power, but not the 9th Air Force in this case in particular, would be particularly important in seeing that breakthrough, and that strategic bombers, heavy bombers, might also play a role in essentially leveling a path through the German lines, as they did right over the Panzerlehr division in the breakout, Lautenschild's breakout, and so there was a big debate about how the bombers were to be used, and the initial pushback from the Brits was not just Harris but Churchill as well, as no, these bombers have been one of the two things that we've been able to get at the Germans with throughout the entire war. One's the campaign in North Africa, and the other is to strike at the Reich as our bombers. So we're going to keep control of them. And Eisenhower said, well, if you don't give me control of the bombers, I'll just have to go home. I will simply have to go home, he said. He was blessed with a particularly capable airman as his deputy Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Forces. That's Arthur Tedder, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, who's right next to Eisenhower up there. Yeah, there he is, right there. And so there was a series of debates about how the bombers were best to be used to produce effects and aggregate effectiveness as they tried to not just push the invasion force back into the water, but to reinforce and to be able to maneuver at the tactical and operational levels within the battle space. So what it came down to essentially was Tedder and his chief scientist, a guy named Solly Zuckerman, a fascinating character, were heavily in favor of what they called the transportation campaign. And the idea was to smash up to smash up large rail yards, marshalling yards, as they were called, large rail centers, particularly locomotives. The British had known since the 30s that the Germans were particularly short on what they called motive power, or locomotives. And this slide basically shows what happened once the transportation campaign went into effect. But to finish the brief story, the Spots and Company pushed hard for what they called the oil campaign, believing that if they hit German synthetic oil plants in particular, but all German oil producing and allied producing capacities, as in the Romanians in Ploiești, the single biggest natural oil production, crude oil production site in Europe, actually in outside of a couple of places in Texas, the world at the time, that they could do really severe long-term damage. Eisenhower eventually said, yeah, that sounds good, but I need short to mid effects. I need the Germans to be much less able to move forward, pass, to maneuver, to shift along the front, whatever the front looks like once we land. And so I'm going to go with the transportation campaign. You got to remember, the Allies had about 4,400 operational four-engine bombers and about 14,000 total combat aircraft when you add mediums and fighter bombers and others. So he quietly whispered to Spots, hey, it's okay for you to go ahead and bomb some oil targets. And so he quietly unleashed Acre, Mediterranean Allied Strategic Air Forces, Mediterranean Allied Air Forces, and MASAF, the strategic component of that, the heavy bomber component, on Ploiești in April. So the transportation campaign began in March. The oil campaign effectively began in April and got into high gear in May. And then when the buzz bombs started to come in, there was a panic, obviously, because they killed a lot of Brits. And so they had to divert assets to attack those, which slowed the other two campaigns, but by no means undermined what they were trying to do, which was make it very difficult for the Germans to mass and maneuver, and over the long term to starve them of fuel and make it very difficult for them to get spare parts and ammunition and everything else at the fighting front. So at the end of the day, it was almost a moot point. It wasn't entirely moot, but when you have 14,000 combat aircraft, you can engage in multiple campaigns in parallel.
This is what, when I do various lectures lately, I've been emphasizing the American production miracle that kicks in late 43 and 44, where we get to have so much in the way of planes and arms and divisions and tanks and so forth that we didn't have to necessarily choose between A or B. In the Pacific, for example, by mid 44, we're able to choose to go both with the Central Pacific campaign and MacArthur's Southwest campaign, because we had enough ships and we had enough men and material that we could do both. And it's behind all this is that American production miracle. It's a whole nother story. Any questions for Rob on this particular aspect of the air campaign, choosing these various plans and the debate that occurred?
No, I thought he was very good with his presentation.
Well, and Rob's only touched the surface of what he could talk about, I want to tell you. We could have Rob on for the next week.
I believe it.
I would advise against it, because there are some other great historians that can get to the human interest aspect of this thing, Colin being amongst them. The sort of dance off I'll give you, and I've got a bunch of other slides that perhaps Glenn can make available to interested parties. I'm always happy to follow up, but the end result was that the Germans, suffered terribly at the tactical and operational levels ultimately as a result of the interactions between the transportation and the oil campaigns. Once the Luftwaffe had been hammered hard in argument, the Air Force, again, had enough aircraft that it didn't stop going after Luftwaffe targets. They dispersed their industry even further. They moved Me-262 production to underground facilities. So they were always able to get up a certain number of aircraft. But their best pilots were dead. They couldn't train enough new ones fast enough. Most of the new ones they trained lasted a mission or two or three. And then once the oil campaign kicked in, I don't know if you have time to put that one slide up that shows the fuel, the drop in their fuel production. Just
that-
it's towards the end. It's in the oil campaign
slide
slides.
13.
Yeah, should be right.
Yeah, I got it.
It's a slide that has it shows a graph that shows production going off a cliff
As
in
I'm-
late 44.
Yeah, I got it. As I'm putting this up, could I a little bit of housekeeping with Sean? Hey, Sean,
Yeah.
towards the end of this, I'd like to explain to the audience our trip to England in
Yes.
September. Could you be ready to put that slide up for us, please?
I will definitely put that web page up, and I will make sure that we thank our sponsors and give everyone our survey. I'll put the survey into the chat now, which is a 2.5-minute survey. So if you would like to give us your thoughts on tonight's program, please feel free to click the link. And I know Greg Yost also has a broader question in the chat that I unmuted him for. So survey in the chat.
All right, so I'll be very brief. You can see what happened to production of synthetic, and the same thing basically happened to the production and ultimately the distribution of fuel to the German fielded forces, ground and air, in the summer and into the fall of 44 and then into the spring of 43. The little recuperation you see there, and it's quite limited, in the winter months had everything to do with the weather and the fact that the Germans had about 400,000 men repairing these oil facilities, and they could squeeze out a week or two of production in between raids, which were both night precision raids by Bomber Command, which had much longer range, could get the distant biggest synthetic oil plants at places like Leuna. The Lancaster carried 14,000 pounds of bombs, and it could do it as far as Leuna. B-17s couldn't get that far in the winter with enough tonnage to do enough damage, not enough daylight. And so the Brits actually took a fairly large share of this, even as Harris constantly screamed about panacea targets and we need to keep hitting cities and so on. So, so between, slowing the German ability to move and maneuver and engage in Normandy, and then creating absolute oil and ammunition and other shortages later in the war, as the oil plants went down, as the Reichsbahn itself, the German railways were knocked out, and they could no longer move coal to the factories or spare parts between the factories to assemble them, or the parts from the dispersed factories to put together whole weapon systems. And as movement and distribution of fuel and ammunition collapsed at the front, the cataclysm for the Wehrmacht was worse and worse. So the casualty ratios that you see here, I'll just explain very briefly, and then I'll call it, because I know you guys want to get to that last slide for the tour. So by 1945, units had enough fuel to move between 2 and 7 miles before they ran out of fuel without any predictable or known resupply because of the complete chaos in the rail networks. In the opening week of the Russian winter offensive, which caught the Germans flat-footed because the Russians had never, in the last couple of previous 2 years, sprinted directly into another major offensive in the winter. The Germans had not been able to bring up enough fuel, and the 1,300 of their last 1,600 or 1,700 tanks ran out of fuel almost immediately and were overrun. So the rest of the war in the East, they fought with far too few tanks. Same in the West. And if you look at the numbers there, the casualty ratios, so in Normandy, when it was a war of attrition, it was a 1-to-1 casualty ratio. Once the breakout occurred, Operation Cobra, and then the Falaise Gap, the campaign went to a 2-to-1 ratio. At the borders of the Reich, where the Germans had used hedgehog defensive positions and didn't have enough fuel to maneuver very far, the casualty ratio was 5-to-1. Most of those being German prisoners of war who ran out of ammunition, ran out of fuel, had to surrender. The Ruhr pocket, 8-to-1. Same thing. They fought like hell. They had ammunition and fuel, and once they were out of all of that, there wasn't much option. They surrendered. And in the East, which had been as high as 7-to-1, 4-to-1, late into the war, Russians' casualties to German casualties, it leveled to about 1-to-1, which was stunning for the Eastern Front. So the question I posed towards the end of the book and assess a bit is, the highest American casualties went up and up and up. And if you look in the upper left corner of this slide, or right corner, I guess, depending on your view, you'll see the casualties, at about 900,000. The blue line I drew in there is what it likely would have looked like for the Americans if the war had gone on another 2 or 3 or 4 months until the atomic weapons were available or the Germans otherwise collapsed, or a combination of the two. If you take all of the Allied or Grand Coalition armies into effect, the air campaigns probably saved well over 1 million, maybe 1.5 million casualties. And a lot of people will say, well, in a total war of national survival, what's another 1.5 million men, right? Well, it's a lot of men, and if they happen to be from your family, it's a lot of men. So that's it for me. I'm happy to talk to anybody and follow up, and I will give it back to Glenn.
To that point, there was a lot of stuff in the chat that we probably aren't going to be able to get to tonight as we are running up to time here. But what I will do is, because Zoom will send me a file of that chat, I'm happy to send that to both you and Glenn to be combed through if you'd like, just to maybe answer any questions that you feel like you have time for.
Yeah, happy to do it.
Thank you, Rob. Glenn, I can pull up the trip.
Well,
and,
just one point before
Sure.
You do that is that next week, Steve Snyder is going to be our featured guest. Steve, we're looking forward to you being the featured guest. And of course, we're going to focus on your father's experience. And I know you have this great film clip that we're going to show about it. And we're really looking forward to that.
I thought I was on the 22nd.
Oh, wait a second. No, you're right. The 22nd. The 22nd. My fault. I'm just so anxious to get you on. I couldn't hope. Next week is Robert Mattson and Jimmy Stewart's story. My fault. Next week is Robert Mattson and Jimmy Stewart's story. And then on the 22nd is Steve Snyder. My apologies, Steve.
Yeah, because I'm taking my wife out for a Valentine's Day dinner on the 15th. So.
Boy, you're a smart man. Okay, listen, let me finish with this. We've mentioned this before, but it is now live on our website for registration. We are planning this 2024 Masters of the Air tour of World War II England. We're going to see the basic sites. The American airfields will be at Thorpe's Abbott, which is the home of the 100th Air Force. Duxford is the RAF Air Base, and we're going to be there on a weekend. This is September 11th to September 18th. So that weekend is like the 9th and the 10th, if I'm not mistaken, Saturday and Sunday, for the Battle of Britain Air Show, which has not been put on since before COVID. It's a 2-day air show featuring the Battle of Britain. There you see some of the shots of it from last year. So all the information about this is on the website, and just in the last few days has the registration link been available to us. And we hope we can get as many people can go as we can. I know we already have 8 or 10 who have said they're going to sign up. So anybody else would be welcome to come.
By the way, I have something for you guys. If you go to Duxford, a buddy of mine, Sam Worthington Lease, is one of the Spitfire pilots.
Oh, really?
And one of the guys that sometimes sits in as a guest pilot is a fellow by the name of Bruce Dickinson, who was the front man for the rock group Iron Maiden. So, so he flew the Lancaster, and he sometimes flies the fighters. He's rated, but he's also a rated airline pilot. So,
yeah, that's interesting, Colin. Yeah. Well, I'm really looking forward to it. I hope we can get some more of our members interested in coming. Any questions, contact Todd, contact me. We'll be happy to answer them. Is there any last thoughts from anybody that anybody would like to express?
Wayne Wicks?
Got one person there.
Wayne Wicks? I asked you to unmute, Wayne.
Not unmuting.
You see it on on your screen there? There we go, Wayne. You should be able to hear you. Great.
This past week, I watched a documentary on Amazon Prime, and it was named Above and Beyond. It's a 1-hour documentary about a woman and her brother, basically her, going to Belgium and following the steps of her dad, who was a B-17 pilot, was shot down, was in Belgium, and about his escape. It took about 6 months for him to get through Belgium, France, and down to Switzerland. It was a very moving thing, and about a Belgian citizen who was not around when that plane went down, but he visits the plane site almost every day and keeps finding pieces of that plane, and he's making a collection of all those parts. And it's a very good 1-hour documentary to watch. And it was 70 years to the day that he was shot down. So he was shot down December 1st of 43, and she was back there in December 1st of 2013, and it was actually released in 2014. So it's really a good documentary to watch and to hear his story. And he's interviewed a couple times, and it's very moving. So
well, thank you for sharing that with us. And when Steve Snyder comes on February 22nd, you'll enjoy hearing his father's story, because there's a lot of similarities there.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to all for being with us tonight. I hope you all enjoyed it. A special thank you to Rob, to Colin, to Anita, to the other contributors, and a very special thank you, of course, to Ed and Joe. Thank you guys for being on and being so faithful every week. We'll say goodnight.
As we wrap up, we should definitely thank our sponsors here. Thank you all for being here this evening. First of all, we'd like to thank UPMC for Life. They are a healthcare Medicare program. They can help you make sense of Medicare, get the answers and information you need, such as how to choose the Medicare Advantage plan that's right for you. UPMC for Life offers a wide range of affordable Medicare Advantage plans, and military veterans can save money and get more benefits with their Medicare plans. UPMC for Life has plans designed for veterans by veterans, and you can view all your plan options, including their prescription drug coverage, compare costs, and learn all about the benefits you get when you choose UPMC for Life by going to upmchealthplan.com/Medicare. And we'd also like to thank tobacco-free Adagio Health. They've been a longtime supporter of the VBC. They are dedicated to reducing and preventing tobacco use and to getting the word out about the hazards of smoking and secondhand smoke. They're all about health, so they want people to quit. And they do that through classes, nicotine replacement therapy, and a popular quit line, 1-800-QUIT-NOW. They also educate people, children especially, about tobacco use from cigars, cigarettes, pipes, chew, snuff, and other nicotine products like vaping. And finally, they advocate for public and private policies to ensure healthy places to live, work, and play. You can check out everything they have going on at tobaccofree.adagiohealth.org. And if you are visiting us maybe for the first time and found the VBC, we have a free quarterly magazine. If you don't get it, we don't have your address. So send us an email, Sean, SHAUN, at veteransbreakfastclub.org, and we're happy to put that in the mail to you. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and we will see you back on Monday night when we will be interviewing Taylor Kyland. She is the author of Unwavering. This is all about the women who fought to get their husbands, the POWs, back from Vietnam. Just talked with her today, and I'm very excited to interview her this coming Monday. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks to you very much, Sean. Thanks for all the support. Look forward to Monday.